There we go. It started recording.
Okay.
So welcome everybody, and thank you for the introduction, Valley. I'll go straight on to my. Oh, I think somebody's got their mic on. Can I hear an echo? If you can turn your mics off, that's brilliant. Somebody's turned their mic off, so that works brilliantly. I'll go straight on to my workshop aims. So this is what we're going to be sort of hopefully covering in the next 45 minutes or so, and then time for questions at the end. I'll be introducing you and getting to think about what comics are. I know everybody coming to this session, some of you might be huge comics fans, some of you may have never picked up a comics or comic for, so do let me know about that. But I will be introducing to what comics are and their role, particularly in developing visual literacy. We'll also think about the role of comics in developing reading and writing for pleasure, and I'll be drawing on some of my research for that and also some of the research recently from National Literacy Trust. We'll have a little bit of hands-on learning as well, so do make sure you've got a pen or paper and pencil to one side. So we'll be starting to think about the language of comics through drawing, and we'll be particularly thinking about simplification and actually why you don't need to be a great drawer or a confident drawer to make comics. And then finally thinking about that power of drawing and writing for enjoyment and why that's so important. And I think it's World Book Day. So again, celebrating that and comics as a brilliant, and essential part of children's reading diet. And I've just included that cartoon there from Jarrett Lerner, because I think it sends out a really important message to educators. I think as educators, we're very happy to sort of, yeah, we can write. Yes, I can model the mathematics to you, but we often stand in front of children and sort of, talk about our drawing in a sort of deprecating way, saying, oh, I can't draw. And it's so common to hear adults saying they can't draw. Actually, everybody can draw. It's a skill everyone has. I might not be able to draw to the ability you want or are aiming for, but everybody has that skill. And young children use drawing as their first point of communication. It's the first thing they do when they pick up a pen or a crayon, is they start to draw before they start to write. Drawing's a precursor to writing. So what we want to do is try and nurture that and bring it through. And help children to understand that drawing is a very valid and important part of sort of multimodal communication. Just really quickly in terms of housekeeping, I've had some problems with my Wi-Fi recently, so if there are any issues, please put it into the chat and I can try and change onto my phone's hotspot. And the second thing is I will be asking questions. We're a reasonably small group. I'll probably ask you to put questions or respond to questions in the chat. But I might sort of open it up at times if we need to for people just to respond with their mics on. But I'll get started. So this is a question for you, first of all. If I say to you, what are comics? How would you define it? So first of all, I'd just like you to put some ideas, definitions, questions, if you're not sure, into the chat, and we'll have a look what people come up with. So I'll give you just a minute or two for that. And do type in everything. If you're studying comics and have got hundreds of definitions to hand, or if you're sort of very new to them and have got very little idea. I see lots of you typing. I'll see whose ideas pop up first. So thanks, Emma. So a series of pictures, multimedia, like a script with pictures. Brilliant start. Give you about 30 more seconds and then just press enter on what you've got. So Laura, comics to me have always been a simplified version of everything, drawing, writing, language. You either get it or you don't. Of course, not everyone will agree, but that's what I thought growing up. And no, that's fine, Laura. That's great. Visual storytelling using illustrations and text. Some lovely ideas coming out for everybody. Picking up really the important thing that it is that combination of drawing and writing and sort of written language. Dare I got, I think comics come up with a particular way of expressing small fractions of everyday life by using illustrations to convey the aura of the scene. Really good points. Combination of visual text, representation of a story. Some really, really good definitions there, everybody. And I could have put lots of different definitions up on the screen for you. But really, I want you to sort of that broad understanding of what fits under that title of comics. And I think you've come up with it. You know, comics are an art form that combines both visual and text as storytelling. And if I just go on to my next slide, I'll sort of talk through some of the things that, you know, I would use to define comics. So first of all, and this is a really important one, comics are an art form in their own right. They're not a genre. I think quite often they get sort of put as a genre within children's literature, but actually comics as an art form can be fiction, non-fiction. You can get poetry comics. You can get comics in terms of fiction under every genre. So you can have romance comics, you can have action comics, and you can have within non-fiction, you can have comics which are autobiography, which are factual books. They cover all sorts of text types, and they're an art form in their own right. So they're alongside the other arts that are sort of music, poetry, painting, and film, and so on. Secondly, and I think all of you picked this up, they are multimodal. So they're working with more than one form of communication happening. So we've got words and images woven together. Other things we might think about as possible modes might be colour. So what colour is telling us and communicating to us. We might also be thinking about layout. And sometimes that's argued to be a mode. So where our eye is taken in terms of layout across a page and what that communicates. They're very similar in a way to picture books. So picture books can be defined as image texts, and so can comics. They've got that interweaving of the words and the images together, and they don't tend to work separately on their own. Talking about sort of like the forms you might find them in, there's sometimes that sort of difference people might put between graphic novels and comics. But actually, graphic novels are just a format of comics. And I think the best way to understand how comics as an art form can be found in different genres is to do a comparison with film. So think about the way you can see a film at the cinema, you can watch it on a video, on DVD, digitally on your laptop. It's the same film, it's the same art form, but it has different formats. And that's exactly the same as comics. You might find them as the sort of soft, papery, bound with staples. You might find them as a book. You can find them digitally online. So you can find them all sorts of formats. I've talked about those sorts of 2 points there about genre and non-fiction and fiction, but they're also for all ages of readers. Sometimes people sort of assume they're for younger children, but actually I would argue they're for all ages of readers. And that sort of brings me on to my next slide. So my next slide is just really thinking about some of the misconceptions or some of the things that might be true about comics in education. So these are sort of true or false, and I want you to do these as quickly as possible. So I'm going to flash up the first one, and into the chat, just put true or false. So vocabulary does not provide enough challenge. They are too easy. I'm getting lots of false, and you would be correct. So research which has been done at California State University actually shows that the language used in comics is actually more advanced than most prose text that you will find. And it often has almost twice as many rare or difficult words as prose books that are aimed at the same age groups. And I think the reason behind that is they can actually use more complicated and difficult vocabulary because the images alongside the words support the understanding of language. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about with comics. So my next one. Images mean that readers aren't developing their reading skills. True or false? You are all very good at this game. So again, we all know as teachers that reading images is just the same in terms of inference and comprehension and understanding as reading the words. And actually, again, what is shown with comics is in between the negotiation of the images and the words, which can sometimes support each other or might be showing slightly different things, that children are having to make really in-depth inference, and adults really in-depth inference about what is going on and how the words and the images connect. Good, I'm going to put another one in there. So comics contain inappropriate content. This is an interesting one. Is it true or false or somewhere in between? I've got sometimes, not always, true, false. Yeah, again, you're absolutely right. I think one of the issues that does come up with comics is that there can be some assumptions that all comics are suitable for children. And certainly plenty of comics or graphic novels are actually aimed at an adult audience. You will find on some published comics, actually, they have an age group recommendation for them. You particularly find that on manga. So a lot of manga is rated for teens and above, but there is some that is all ages. So it's really sensible to actually have a look at what the comic might contain first. Is this going to be appropriate content for a younger audience, particularly if you're using in the schools? What is it going to contain? But again, that's the same as just any other art form. There's going to be films which are suitable for young people and films which aren't. The same for novels and other art. Okay, my next one, I think I'll go through these quite quickly. Comics are a genre. I've talked about that one. They're certainly not. I'll go on to my next one. Once children start reading them, they'll never read anything else. What do we think about this one? True or false? Lots of falses coming up. And again, you'd be absolutely right about generally about them. I think Emma said if they do, that is okay, but it's unlikely. And there was some really interesting research done by the National Literacy Trust last year, looking at children's reading habits. And what they found is that children who read comics are children who generally choose to read for pleasure more than children who don't read comics, who are less likely to choose to read for pleasure. And that means the children who are reading comics see reading as enjoyable, reading as something that's for them. They have that identity as a reader, and that means they're most likely to be going on to read something else besides comics to develop their reading diet alongside the enjoyment of reading comics. And as an adult, I read everything. I read comics, graphic novels, I read the news. I'm always reading and having that rich reading diet, which includes for me graphic novels and comics. And finally, my last one there, it isn't proper reading. I feel that we've probably proved that through all the other true and false that we've looked at. It certainly is proper reading. It's something that really needs to be celebrated and enjoyed. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, I will go on to my next slide then. This one has got a lot of references, a lot of detail in it, so don't worry about absorbing it all. But these are just some of my arguments for why comics do need to be in the school, in the classroom. So first of all, they've been identified as really helping and supporting and engaging reluctant readers. But that's not to say they're not for other readers too, but there is something about them that really helps children who struggle perhaps with reading to see and identify themselves as readers. And that's probably the combination again of the words and the images working together to scaffold and support reading. Again, as we noticed, that research does show that students who read comics are subject to a wide range of complex vocabulary, lots of interesting and important evidence about that. they also have that link between the creative arts and literacy. And as a result, they're really rich for exploring multimodal composition. And we talk a lot at the moment about living in increasingly visual times. And I've been thinking about how children might critically think about the information they receive online and understanding that, and understanding of multimodality is really important in supporting that. Interestingly, again, in terms of drawing, which is part of comics making, so drawing has been shown to really support children to formulate and extend their ideas for writing. So sort of moving into children's comic making now, it really can be a useful tool for scaffolding and supporting other types of writing and narrative formation. And again, research around children's creating their own comics suggests, in addition to this creativity, the process of creating that work can create those opportunities for children's critical thinking, so decision making about what they're going to include or not within their work, about their identity exploration. So when we're creating narratives, we're starting to think about ourselves and who we are as people and the stories we want to tell. And it can also develop community engagement, and particularly by sharing the work children do within comics making, that can reach out into the local community. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in my own research. Okay. So I was going to start off on the next section, thinking about comics and visual literacy. And in terms of thinking of a definition there for visual literacy, it's the ability that we have to look at visual images and interpret them, evaluate them, but also to be able to create images ourselves that communicate ideas. And there is some interesting research that shows, the idea and understanding of sequences of images in comics is not universal. It is a learned skill. So it's something that we can teach to children. Lots of children do come with that skill, but not all children pick it up. So it's something we can teach as well. And that children's development of proficiency in sequencing images develops over time. I think this is quite interesting. We see comics being published for younger readers at the moment, so children in Key Stage 1. But at that stage, they're still learning to think about how sequencing works and sort of moving on from picture books. So most comics being published probably are for about 6 or 7-year-olds upwards rather than younger children. And again, one of the things to be really aware of with children in school is that actually, although some children might be really good at reading, might have really good fluency in reading, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be good at reading images. So the two don't necessarily go hand in hand. So you may find that some highly skilled readers of words in your classroom struggle to actually interpret the meaning in images. So that's why it's really important to start exploring with children, if you're teaching about comics in the classroom, about visual literacy, about how these things work. So I'm going to give you a sort of visual literacy activity that you can do. And I've chosen, just in case people didn't know different characters from comic books, I have chosen some characters from a film, which I think is really well known and you should hopefully recognize. So here are 2 images from the well-known Disney animation, The Lion King. And we've got on the left the character of Scar, and we've got on the right Simba and his father. And I just want you to look at those 2 different silhouettes. This activity I've taken from a book called The Graphic Novel Builder by Edward Ross, which looks at silhouettes of comic characters. But looking at these 2 silhouettes, what do we notice? Again, put this into the chat. What do we notice about the silhouette of Scar? What do we notice about the silhouette of Simba and his father? I'll give you just a minute to think about that and put it into the chat. Think about their shapes. Think about how they look. Brilliant, Emma. So Emma's put about the colours being different. We've got the green, perhaps indicating evil. I mean, that's again part of your understanding of visual literacy there. That visual literacy, colours have different meanings And they do have different meanings from culture to culture. So, the symbol of white in the UK might mean something different to the colour of white in India. Again, the colour of red in China might have different meaning to the colour of red in Western countries. Daniela's put about the stylization of Scar being more readable, identifiable. The live action could be any other lion. So perhaps it is sort of a difference between the two. More realistic. Maybe on looks like an actual photo. Think again as well about the shapes, really focusing on the silhouettes. How are the silhouettes different? Hannah, brilliant. So the image of Scar has sharper lines. And Laura above, Scar's got pointed edges, just a face Scar represented on it. And Simba and Dad's softer edges, the whole body to show the difference in size. The other two look softer, says Hannah. Brilliant, really, really good point. So we have got that. If you know the story of the Lion King, Scar is the evil uncle. It's based on Hamlet, the story, and we've got Simba and his father, who are the faces of good within the story. And this is a really common thing to see between characters that represent evil and characters that represent good. We see all those spiky edges to Scar. He looks spiky, he looks unpredictable. We've got that green background, and green does tend to symbolize sort of evil or witchery within Western cultures. We've got Simba and his father on the other side looking softer and rounder. So those are sort of more used with good characters, gentle characters, kind characters that we might have. And again, the colours behind them being represented are warm. We've got oranges glowing, which tend to represent, again, that kindness, that warmth within characters. So just by looking at those two images, we're starting to really think deeply about what's being communicated visually to us through the colours, through the shapes that we have. Another thing that's really interesting to explore in terms of visual literacy and comics is around how they're organised and laid out. And there are some really key words that are really useful to know. So again, probably some of the most common terms to come across is the term panel. So the panel is the name given to each sort of individual frame in a comic that you might see. But the panels can be all sorts of different sizes. Sometimes they're all exactly the same size. If you're looking at perhaps a comic strip on Instagram, it makes lots of use about the squares being the same size and works in that way. But lots of comics you'll find that actually the different panels are different sizes, and that can be used to effect. You can have lots of small panels happening to show something happening rapidly. You can have a whole page panel, as we've got there, which is sometimes called a splash page, which shows an event in close up with lots of action, something you really want to highlight within the comic. We also have the other term called gutter. Gutter is probably my favourite part of comics terminology, and gutter means the gap between the panels. This is a really interesting thing to examine because this is where the reader has to make connections. The reader has to infer what's happening in one panel to the next, and that meaning is made within that gutter. And again, that gutter can be with it as it is within this comic. It can be clear on the screen. It can be coloured in. It can be fuzzy. And the same with panels. You might find they've got fuzzy edges. They might have no clear edges at all. So lots of comic makers play around with that. We also have things that you all know. Everybody knows the term speech bubbles. We don't just find them in comics. We find them everywhere now, even though they did originate in comics first of all. We have things that are useful to talk about, such as the movement lines. So again, this is often used in comics to show how somebody's moving. And we've got lots of them happening there. You can see on the page as the robots are flying through the air. We also have the sound effects. As we would probably normally call them to teach in the classroom, are onomatopoeia, but actually sound effects works much better because in a comic, you can almost imagine it coming to life as though it was a film. And we see those written, not in the speech bubbles, but directly onto the page. So we've got whack there and kazow. And I think what's really interesting about onomatopoeia in comics is the way that the words themselves are visualized. They become part of the visual image too. And we can see playing around with different fonts there within that. Other terms that might be useful to know are about tier. So a tier is just sort of the levels of panels on the page. And also that word there, bleed. So bleed just means when it goes up to the edge of the page and actually all the colours go up to the edge rather than sometimes having that margin around the edge as well. Are there any questions about the terminology? Anything people would like to know before I move on to the next section? Do you just sort of put your mic on if you want to? Otherwise, I'll move on. Okay. So as I said, I was going to hopefully just talk you through a little bit of my own research into comics in schools and also share with you a little bit of research from the National Literacy Trust. So my research has been quite small scale. I do action research as my methodology. And this was a piece of research I did back in 2020. So a while ago now, and actually it's formed the basis of the basis of some of my PhD research. So a project I carried out in school was looking at the impact of creating a school-based comics library for 7 to 8 year olds. It was in a large school in Lambeth, and I worked with about 120 children during the course of this project. And it took place over 8 weeks, and during which the class had 5 half-hour weekly library sessions. So the children came, I had a whole selection of comics and graphic novels for them to borrow and choose from. They took them home. They also could take them into their classrooms if they wanted to, and then they came back the following week to swap them over. From this research came out really 3 key findings, and I'll just talk you through these briefly. But first of all, really the role of this comics library in building a community of comics readers. So this really links into that idea around reading for pleasure and reading being a social practice. And there's some lovely quotes there from the children and the teachers, but as one of the class teachers noticed, it was really a lot about children swapping the comics over with their friends. I love the quote from a child who said, "I love swapping comics with my friends and exchanging jokes," from the Beano. So they're sort of swapping there in 2 ways, both physically the comics themselves, but swapping their jokes too. As the class teacher noticed, some of the most reluctant readers were the keenest on swapping. Swapping and recommending has been a highlight. So that's something the children really enjoyed and loved in the project. The next thing that came out of the research was children's increased confidence as readers. So, it was lucky. These children in school were generally quite confident in their reading. So when I asked them before the project started, it's positive, 77% said they were good or excellent readers. But around about 23%, so almost a quarter, said they were average readers. So they didn't see themselves as somebody who was probably as good as some of the other peers in their classrooms. Once the project came to an end, I asked the children the same questions again, and this time 91% said they were good or excellent readers. And that quarter of the children who said they were average readers have now fallen down to just 9% of the children. So there was a real impact here on how the children saw themselves as the readers. And again, thinking about the research there or the feedback there from the class teachers, said some of the most reluctant readers were the keenest. It helped them with their confidence and made them the ambassadors. So that's something that, again, really picked up from this research, was the power of comics to really increase children's confidence as readers. Finally, and although I sort of expected or hoped to expect the first 2 outcomes, this was an outcome I didn't expect at all, and surprised me and actually really interested me and engaged me about why it happened. So lots of the children who had been reading the comics just started making their comics of their own volition. Parents started reporting this as well. So one of them talked about their daughter had made a comic strip. She seemed to understand the concept and the styles of the writing well. And another child there, who their parents talk about, he's working on a few different ideas, one that he asked us to help with and one of his own. He started by copying the comics that he likes, but he's now developing his own style and characters. And this bit interested me so much, it has become my PhD research. So from this, I set up a comics club where I went into comics making with the children alongside their comics reading. Alongside my research, which I said is small scale, it's, very qualitative in its approach, is the research of the National Literacy Trust. So this is a very large scale survey, 64,000 children, in fact, who are surveyed. And again, they looked at, within their research, all the children who started talking about actually their enjoyment of comics. And one of the things that they found out, again, and it's similar to my research, that the children who are reading comics rated themselves as very good or good readers compared to those who didn't read comics. And they also found that nearly twice as many children and young people who read comics in their free time told us they enjoyed reading compared with those who didn't read comics in their free time. They also found out why children were talking about why they chose to read comics. And I think there's some really interesting responses there. I do enjoy reading my comics a lot because I really like the illustrations and the way they express their feelings. So a lot of there about talking about expressing feelings, but also expressing themselves. I think the characters in the comics help me express myself. I enjoy reading comics because I really like the artwork, but also interestingly there, again, thinking about understanding of visual literacy, about creativity within comics. I like reading comics because it heightens my creative intelligence. And this research you can find in the Future of Literacy report by the National Literacy Trust, which was published at the end of last year. And then again, interestingly, and sitting alongside my research, they also found that children who are reading comics wanted to make comics as well. And again, children were telling them it's their own volition. It wasn't a question they asked. And some lovely things there. I write to make comics with my friends. I write stories and mangas in my free time because I love creative writing and want to become an author. And I think this is particularly pertinent at a time when we're seeing in other research children's reading for pleasure and writing for pleasure decreasing, that children who engage with comics and comics making are actually increasing their enjoyment of reading for pleasure and their enjoyment of writing and drawing and creating for pleasure too. So my last bit of my presentation is to get you to do a little bit of drawing yourselves and start to think a little bit about comics making. I will go over this slide quickly, so I'll move myself quickly onto the next slide. But again, another place to look for things about comics, brilliant book, Hacking Graphic Novels by Shweta Miller. But thinking about tackling that fear of drawing. Drawing's that vehicle for thinking. It's not always about it being fine rendered or aesthetically impressive work, so you don't need to be an art teacher or talented artist yourself to teach students to think metaphorically using colours, symbols, and images. And I really, really think that's such an important thing to understand visual communication. It's not about things being represented really accurately. It's about being able to communicate ideas through words and images in comics. So that is the key thing that we really want to focus on. So have a quick look at those faces. Here are some famous comics from all around the world. So we've got Tintin by Hergé, from Franco-Belgian comics. We've got Heartstopper, hugely popular in the UK with early teens currently, and My Hero Academia, world famously popular manga from Japan, and a huge series. But have a look at those faces. What do you notice about them? How many lines or marks are being used to create the features? There's no right or wrong to this, so maybe just put a number into the chat or something you notice, and we'll go from there. Yeah, so the characters are made up of complex lines. We've got a lot of simplification going on. Simple lines, limited features. simple but expressive. Brilliant. Lots of really, really important points there. What I'm going to do, and just bear with me, I am going to stop sharing this and hopefully move to my other camera. And hopefully you can see now my hand and a piece of paper on the table. Brilliant.
Yes, we can.
Okay, we're going to do some drawing. So hopefully you have got a pen and paper to hand. And again, nobody's going to see what you're doing, so it can be however you want. But I'm going to show you some simple ways we can do expressions. That's a really nice way into showing children about the simplification in comics. So we're going to start off by drawing a really simple circle. And in that, I'm just going to draw 2 more circles as eyes. I'm going to put a dot in the middle. I'm just going to draw a line round to make a nose. Give that a go yourself. And then I'm going to add some eyebrows. And they're going to be going up like little rainbows. And I'm going to add a smiley face. So a curved line going downwards like an upside down rainbow. And I've drawn somebody with a happy expression. Let's try that again. So another circle. It's not perfect, it's a bit bigger. 2 eyes again, and a nose. But this time I'm going to change things around. So this time my eyebrows are going to be the other way up, like 2 upside down rainbows. And my mouth is going to be the other way round. And I've created somebody looking sad. Let's try that a 3rd time. Again, exactly the same. Eyes, nose. This time I'm going to keep the sad face or the sad mouth like that, but I'm just going to change the eyebrows this time. And do straight line eyebrows going down. This time I've suddenly got an angry face. And just by changing the eyebrow shape, I've changed the facial expression. I'm going to do a final face for you. The eyes exactly the same again. The nose exactly the same again. I'm going to keep my downward slanting eyebrows, but this time I'm going to go back and use my smiley face, maybe slightly off to the side. And this time I've created somebody looking, well, I don't know, evil, mischievous, naughty. But it shows you how very simply you can play around with a few lines and you can create a whole range of different expressions really quickly, really easily. And if I had more time, I would allow you to play around with that. So if you do want to keep on doodling, making faces, while I go for the final bit of the presentation, please do. I'm very much a doodler when I am listening. So I will just go back to my presentation. Bear with me while that loads. Let me just get myself back to the right slide. So really, just to summarise then, and this comes from an up-and-coming book that I've written with Lucy Starbuck-Braidley, who works for the National Literacy Trust, and we've been working together on creating a book about comics in the classroom. These are some of the recommendations we really have for thinking about what a comics-rich classroom might look like, and it sort of builds on our research some of the things that we've been talking about. So thinking about building that community of comic readers and makers, so celebrating comics in all their forms. Treating each child as a comic maker So realizing that it's about drawing simply, we can all engage with it. It's about communicating ideas. This is a classroom that you read comics, you share comics, you think and talk about comics making. So we're making it normal to discuss drawing and writing comics with children as well, as part of their creativity and their telling of narratives. But we can start to teach children how comics work. So as educators, we start to develop our understanding of comics as a form of literature too, in the same way we would understand perhaps the process of writing or how to teach reading to children. Setting children goals and creating opportunities to give children that opportunity for personal comics making projects, but also working together collaboratively and perhaps making and sharing comics to the wider school community. And an outcome of my comics club was always having a comics fair where we celebrated comics making and shared our comics and sold our comics to the local community. So that is me sort of quickly whizzing through everything I wanted to tell you and talk to you about, and giving time for questions at the end. So please now do turn your mics on or put into the chat any thoughts or questions you might have. Ali, you've got your hand up, and I think some people are typing in the chat.
Okay, well, maybe we can start us off by asking, how would you advise a teacher to start working with comics? Creating comics, you talked about the comics club that you created. Are there some tips that you could give to teachers, some suggestions about how to get started if they're interested in integrating comics, in the literacy work in the classroom, let's say in the primary school classroom?
Absolutely. So I think Laura's asked a similar question in the chat. She said about how can I simply introduce comics into my classroom? Obviously there's different things to bear in mind, and obviously I'm aware around, getting books into the classroom, comics into the classroom. In terms of sort of some simple tips about, first of all, comics reading. So one is, if you're in a school, is making sure the senior leadership team see the value of comics. So they might give you funding to get comics into the classroom. Other ways you can do it is actually one of the things that I did for my comics club and the comics library was I just asked. So I found loads of people in the local community or parents who had old copies of comics such as the Beano or the Phoenix, which is a fantastic comic. And they just sort of gave me huge bundles of them. So I actually ended up with lots of comics to share with the children. I think in terms of comic making, I think if you are an educator, first of all, read comics. There's also lots of books about how to make comics. So one I mentioned was this one here, Graphics Novel Builder, which actually, if I go through my slides, I've got on, I think this slide here. There's also the Cartoonist Club. That's a brilliant one. So it's been created by Scott McLeod and Raina Telegmeier, which is told through comics form, like Graphic Novels Builder, but takes you through different ways and approaches, and a little bit about comics theory as well around making comics. And another brilliant book I recommend. This is from the 1990s now, but it's still one of the seminal texts. So Understanding Comics by Scott McLeod, which again in comics form takes you through some of the theory, some of the things to think about. As a teacher would really help develop your subject knowledge, so you then feel confident teaching children about comics making. And I'd also quickly just introduce this book as well, coming in July. So a bit of self-publicity, but this is the book that will be coming out hopefully in July that we've been writing, which really, I've given you a very quick introduction to some of the elements of this book, but there's chapters around comics and reading for pleasure, visual literacy, oracy, and also within representation, inclusion, and sustainability education. So again, comics in the classroom coming out hopefully later this year is a really in-depth way of looking at how you can use comics in the classroom with practical examples. Each chapter has a case study.
That's great, Helen. We've got a couple of questions for you. One is specifically for EAL learners. And are there any comics, Daniela asks in particular, you would recommend for EAL students?
This is a brilliant question. And I think, again, I think it's about their interests, isn't it? It's about their own knowledge that they're bringing to it, and their own experience. So I think, again, just having a variety of comics there. I think if you're having children who are very new to English, it might be finding things which they are familiar with, but also finding comics that are going to help introduce them to that sort of reading community in the classroom. And I think particularly I would say books like Dogman, are hugely popular. Children enjoy reading them, swapping them over, talking about them. So if you're sort of wanting to help your EL students develop their talk and discussion around reading and comics books, actually those comics that introduce them to being part of a comics community can be really important. But again, each student with English as additional language is very different. So it is always the case of finding the right comic for the right child. I do love Dogman, and I honestly I know there can be some condescending thoughts, Hannah, about Dogman, but Dave Pilkey has kept so many children reading. It's amazing. So I have huge amount of gratitude to him. And he was somebody who was dyslexic in school himself and got told off for making comics in schools. So I think, he's done a huge service to getting all children to be readers.
I think your point, Helen, to encourage students to read texts that they're already familiar in the stronger literate language, that's a really good way of bridging any linguistic or cognitive differences between the languages.
And again, I can't make assumptions that any child with English as additional language can read in their home language. But if they can, you can find, for example, Tintin has been translated into thousands of languages. I've got a Welsh version of Tintin downstairs that I've just been given. So if you can find texts that sit alongside each other, that might be helpful for children who can read in their home language.
Absolutely. Helen, there's another question specifically about using comics in MFL, modern foreign languages, as a way to introduce vocabulary in a fun way. And Hannah asks, do you know of any resources in other languages?
Again, a really good question. I would say modern foreign language is not necessarily. I'm a primary school teacher. I know we do teach it in primary school, but not well enough. So again, I think it would be a case of thinking about how you want to use them. It could be that you want to use them in terms of children making comics, and I've seen a lovely project recently, and again, with links into children with English additional language, where children were making comics both in their home language, but also in English as well. And I think that was lovely. So they were actually thinking about changing whether they're going to write in English or their home language in the comics. So again, I think ways that you can think about developing children's understanding of the language development alongside the images that they're using can be a really purposeful way of using comics in that way.
Great. I see one of our participants has raised her hand. Ada, would you like to take the floor? Unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, it was such a great opportunity for me, especially as a pre-service teacher. Right now, I'm just doing my macro teaching as a teaching practicum school. And my question is, will it be possible for us to include these comic books to conduct a lesson? For example, using one of the comic books that we choose and use it in a lesson plan, for example. Did you have any experiences regarding in this point?
What sort of lesson are you thinking about? A reading lesson, an English?
A reading lesson.
A reading lesson. Yeah, absolutely. Again, it depends how you're going to be doing that reading lesson. So I don't know if you'd have copies of the comic for all the children, or you might want to have a comic up on the board. One of the ways that I find is best to read comics collaboratively is actually to act it out. I think comics are very similar in a way to if you think to film or to a play. In fact, I think comics are better in some ways at representing plays than any other, text form. So I think probably I would say if you're reading it together, acting it out, can you make it come to life? So different people reading as, almost as though a script. So different people reading for the different characters. You might want to have somebody acting as a narrator. So obviously some comics might have sort of boxes which are telling you what's happening at certain points, which almost sort of has that narrator voice to it. So I think acting it out would be my first starting point with reading a comic as a class.
Thank you a lot.
Thanks, Helen. And one last question here from Hannah. She's saying that as a child, I was put off reading comics as I saw it as a boys' thing, perhaps because of the genres which were popular at the time. Do you think that this is changing? And how to encourage girls to engage with comics as an art form? Do you see a disparity between boys and girls engagement with comics, whether it's comics writing or comics reading?
So I think, no, this is absolutely a fascinating question. And I'm going to make no suppositions about your age, Hannah, at all. But that's very much my experience as a reader of comics. When I was young, I loved comics. I read them all. Me and my brother swapped over comics. So although the Tintin and Asterix was bought for him, I read them as much as he did, if not more. And I read lots of comics that I bought. And then when I got to about the age of sort of 13 or 14, I couldn't quite find the next thing for me. And I don't like superhero comics. They are not for me. They're not my interest. And I suddenly found going into comic shops quite intimidating, very male environments. So I think that is something that a lot of people, particularly, I don't know, people of my age or people a bit younger than me, have experienced. I think that is completely and utterly changing now. And I see when I've done my research, I saw absolutely no gender difference between the comics children were reading, their engagement with it. And with my comics club that I've run, there's never been any sort of skew one way particularly or another over time of more girls or more boys coming along. And I think a lot of what is published nowadays is really mindful of that. I mean, we still have comics which are aimed at certain sort of genders, perhaps. But I think nowadays, as I said, I've talked about Dogman a lot, but I think about all the other comics being published, such as Bunny versus Monkey, Neil Cameron's brilliant Donut series, which has become incredibly popular recently. And also, I think there is a lot of comics out there, I would say, for female readers or readers who want to read about female experiences in their teenage years. So I think, Raina Tellemeier writes beautifully about being a young teen. And there's some brilliant YA out there as well. And again, in terms of, I think, inclusion and representation, we see a lot of that within comics as well. So we see lots of comics about thinking about sexuality, comics which are looking at being inclusive in terms of people's gender identity, and we see lots of comics that are exploring all sorts of other themes as well, which I think again makes comics incredibly inclusive now. I mean, again, we might still see in some comics, stereotypes, but that's again the same for any media that I'd be looking at.
That's great. It's great to hear that attitudes are changing, and also that there's such a diversity now in terms of themes and representations. Great. Any other questions? Okay, if there are no other questions or comments, we'll bring this Twilight session to a close. Thank you so much, Helen, for joining us today and sharing your expertise and your experiences, not only as a researcher, but also as somebody who has used comic books and comics in teaching. This is precisely the kind of connection between research and practice that we would like to make through the Twilight session. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, if you want to find out more, this has been a very whistle-stop tour. So do be in touch. I think my email was there on the slides, or you'll be able to contact me via line, Valley, sorry.
Okay, thank you. I'll stop recording now.